In this lecture, we look at migration and immigration patterns. We also look at the salient theories that explain why these patterns emerge and what can we expect in the near future. The ancient world saw mass migration occur through wars and conquests, with large-scale colonization and the transportation of slaves across the Mediterranean and beyond. This involved mostly the Romans, the Greeks, and the Arabs. However, it's really in the 16th century, with the expansion of Europe, that most scholars accept as a starting point for the survey of global migration. The European colonization of Northern and Southern America started a steady stream of Europeans to the Americas. This was notably the case of Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands. The emergence of new technologies and the desire to maintain the colonial economic system led to the second wave of migration of Europeans taking slaves from Africa to America. The search for trade along coastal regions of the colonies generated global and more systemic patterns of migration. When we look at triangular trade that developed, we saw that the main trading routes in colonization occurred between Western Europe, the west coast of Africa, and the Americas. The trading route involved the transportation of European goods to Africa, African slaves to the Americas, and produce from the Americas back to Europe. Between 1500 and 1850, approximately 10 million African slaves were transported to the Americas. Slaves became a crucial sort of element to the expansion of capitalism. Paralleling such movements were the transportation of convicts from England to America and Australia. During this period of European expansion and colonization, the movement of people was largely forced and coerced. This idea can be really understood when we look at labor migration patterns, whereby migration from a labor standpoint can be seen in a binary structure, where there's a center and a periphery, where this sort of center and periphery can be used to explain the interlinkages between the growth of capitalism and the migration. Migration within this perspective showed that individual choice did not factor into the process. Rather, that the independent development of the center, here we're talking about Europe, created dependent development at the periphery, i.e. the colonies. And again, we can see how this flows when we look at labor migration patterns. In fact, these flows of human capital are linked to the hierarchical system of production and power. In addition to the European expansion, people from other regions moved in great numbers too. Between 1850 and 1914, 10 million Russians moved to Central Asia and Siberia, 1 million Southern Europeans to Northern Africa, and 12 million Chinese to East and Southeast Asia, East Africa, and South Africa. The study of migration has lacked a comprehensive theory to explain the process. This is the result of migration crossing so many disciplinary boundaries. Among the main reasons explaining why it's so difficult to generalize about the causes and consequences of migration are the diversity and complexity of the phenomena, as well as the difficulty of separating migration from other socioeconomic and political processes. Foremost, when we look at neoclassical economic theory, it suggests that people move based on the wave differentials. In other words, they're moving from low-wage labor surplus areas to high-wage labor scarce regions. Migration will enable labor to be distributed where it is needed, and eventually there's an equilibrium will be reached where there will be no need for migration, or at least that's what the theory suggests. At a micro level, migrants are seen as rational individuals who calculate the cost and benefit of migrating. Migrants would migrate to places where they're able to generate the highest income and be the most productive. And of course, this is assuming perfect information. This linear progression of development and migration is best represented by the Harris-Todaro model. The model was originally developed to explain the contradiction of continuing rural-urban labor migration despite the rising unemployment rates in the late 1960s. They argued that the idea of income differentials as motivating factor to migrate had to be reconsidered. They suggested that as long as the probability of an urban income would be higher than a rural income, it would outweigh the risk to migrate despite declining opportunities. Now, although this model was initially designed to explain internal rural to urban migration, it's actually been extended to the international context. Put differently, the decision to migrate is seen as an investment opportunity, the investment of human capital. Mind you, when we look at the criticisms of neoclassical theory of understanding migration, it can range from a historical to Eurocentric. And most importantly, it does not account for the wide-ranging constraining factors such as governments and institutions from both the sending and receiving end. Historical structuralists are at the other end of the spectrum, where they critique neoclassical theories on the idea of choice. Individuals do not have free choice in their decision to migrate because they are fundamentally constrained by structural forces. The structuralist perspective believed that migration was not determined by individual and singular choices of migrants. But migration was better explained by framing within global and national economic systems, linkages between developing and industrialized nations. Within a modern setting, structuralist understanding migration was a result of an expansion of capitalism. So as post-war economies expanded, there was a need for industrial workers, where the state was required to recruit new laborers to meet the demand. Central to the structuralist perspective was seeing migrants as a reserve army, and this reinforces sort of center-periphery models. Economics here is such a dominant factor when we look at international migration that the very language of analysis has a tendency to marginalize social or cultural factors. And in fact, structuralists have been criticized as being too rigid and too deterministic in their explanation and understanding of the process of migration. Therefore, it might be worthwhile to explore the spatial frameworks we can employ. A classic theory of immigration contrasts between push factors and pull factors. Push factors are conditions that drive an individual to leave their home nation. So, for example, scarcity of land, few labor opportunities. Pull factors are conditions that motivate immigration to a host nation. Some examples of this might be better labor opportunities, political freedom, better educational opportunities, family. In economic migration, differentials in wage rates are prominent in the push-pull dichotomy. If the value of wages in the host nation surpasses the value of wages in one's home nation, there's a greater incentive to migrate. Some concerns and problems do exist with the push and pull theories, and they include, for instance, the theory does not fully explain the emergence of migrant flows. If push and pull factors was the main motivating sort of characteristics, individuals from poor nations will migrate to rich nations. Moreover, the push and pull theories do not fully explain the stability of patterns of migration. Evidence suggests once a migration pattern has been established between host and home nations, it remains for a relatively long period. We can retort that the pull factor are family-friend networks, creating a chain migration, so to speak. In the end, this sort of brief understanding about the prominent theories used to explain migration all have their shortcomings. However, in understanding contemporary migration, we move on to look at some of the facts and figures. Post-World War II saw a huge increase in international migration, including the displacement of people. Nations such as the United States, Canada, and Australia experienced large increases in their intake of immigrants, particularly from Europe, and most notably from Southern Europe. To rebuild post-war economies, European countries introduced the guest worker program, as we discussed in our previous lecture. France experienced unprecedented growth in the 1960s, which explains the growth of migrant intake. Between 1955 and 1974, 4 million migrants arrived in France. European nations stopped the guest worker programs and tried to encourage migrants to return to their home nations in the 1970s and 1980s. As discussed in our European Models lecture, such policies failed due to poor economic conditions of sending nations, and at the same time, European nations allowed for family reunification. Renewed interest in understanding migration is in one part linked to the developmental process, where migration is seen as a means of developing or put into place factors for development. Before entering a more fruitful discussion about the relationship between migration and development, it's worthwhile looking at some of the charts and figures that gives us some of the background information needed. Foremost, according to the United Nations, the total number of international migrants stood at 191 million in the early 2000s. Approximately 1/3 of these migrants live in developing nations. Thus, when we look at migration, particularly in post-1973, it's from developing nations to developed nations. In fact, if we break it down a bit further, Europe was the destination for 34% of all migrants. North America, about 23%, Asia, 28%, Africa, 9%, Latin America and the Caribbean, 3%, and Oceania, 3%. Nearly half of all migrants are women. And in fact, we find that there are approximately 20 million migrants with tertiary level education at age 25 or over living in an OECD nation. This has increased almost double from the 1990s. Approximately 6 out of 10 highly educated migrants originate from a developing nation in the early 2000s. If we look at the next two charts, the international migrant stock, we can see that all migration can be witnessed globally and in the 6 major regions of the world. We can look at Africa, for example, where African migrants predominantly move to other African nations, with South of Africa and West Africa being the subregions most affected by labor mobility in Africa. In Asia, the largest source of temporary contractual migrant workers can be seen worldwide, and it can be characterized by a large intra-regional flow of migrant workers, particularly in the vast internal movements in China and India. In Europe's regional dynamics differ from others because of the European Union's objective of creating a common migratory space with far-flung but jointly managed external borders. The Americas is characterized by strong south-north migratory flows from Latin America and the Caribbean to the United States and Canada, and increasingly Europe. The United States and Canada continue to be a major receiver of permanent migrants from across the world, but are also facing growing demand for temporary workers. In the Middle East, as we see in this chart here, the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait top the countries with the highest percentage of international migrant stock in total population. We see that temporary contract workers are the most prominent sort of group when it comes to international migrants. In Oceania, it includes the 2 large destination countries, Australia and New Zealand. And on the other hand, it includes small island nations whose populations are increasingly interested in labor migration. What we have seen, though, is that all regions of the world are affected by irregular migration, with irregular migrants representing an estimated 10 to 15% of global migrant stocks. Having looked at these facts and figures, it's not surprising that migration is now seen as a means of development. Migration or mobility is often pursued as a livelihood strategy by social groups such as households in reaction to relative deprivation. Remittances have played an important part in improving the livelihoods of millions of individuals. Improvements to livelihoods depend on the destination of the migration. Where it is south to north migration, individuals will generally yield higher incomes than internal or south-south migration. At the same time, remittances can induce or increase inequalities across developing nations. Internal migration or south-south migration is less selective and costly than south-north migration, and thus the effect of the latter are more likely to increase inequality. For example, when they're looking at studies in Mexico, it showed that an increase of international remittances increased rural inequality by almost 3% compared to a similar increase in internal remittances, which reduced rural inequality by 0.1%. The linkages between migration and economic development for developing nations is a source for study and comparison. And in fact, the case of the Philippines is an interesting one. Philippines is a major exporter of labor, with an estimated almost 8 million Filipinos living overseas in 2005, representing 1/4 of the labor force, which is really a total of about 80 million or so. More women and more highly educated migrants are recent trends in the Philippines' export of labor. In terms of remittances, however, the figures are quite startling. In fact, it stands at approximately 9% of the country's GDP. Let me repeat that. In the Philippines, almost 9% of the country's GDP is due to remittances. It was inconclusive, however, whether these remittances aided the development of the nation. And in fact, according to some studies, it's shown that receiving patterns tend to benefit urban households. Regions with greater wealth are benefiting from remittances rather than the poorest. Nevertheless, remittances play an important role in securing and improving livelihoods of both the individual and the family in the sending area. Now, the idea that remittances are creating a dependent development cannot be ignored. And in fact, when we look at the relationship between the United States and Mexico, this can actually illustrate this point. It is estimated that there's about 11 million immigrants in the United States, with the majority employed in low-skilled, low-wage sectors. A large share of these Mexican immigrants have not completed high school. Working-age Mexican immigrants are more than 6 times as likely as U.S. citizens to lack a high school education. Thus, when we look at the reports, they suggest that there's little incentive to improve educational outcomes in Mexico. There's this so-called brain drain, where the most educated of a developing nation has sought work internationally and is seen as detrimental to the development of the nation. In fact, when we look at the United Kingdom, 1/3 of the UK's registered doctors were trained overseas. Now, the question here is how migration affects development can be a debatable one. However, there's no doubt that migration is both a cause and a consequence of development. And at the individual level, it is pursued as a livelihood strategy. Yet from public debate, in the media, in national policies, it is clear that immigration and immigrants are often in the spotlight. Immigration can be seen as located between the boundaries of the domestic and international sphere. This nexus often makes it difficult to be precise about the terms of the debate. Nonetheless, here we will briefly explore the linkages between immigration and the nation-state, particularly in relation to ideas of national identity, sovereignty, and policy. Globalization has reinforced national sensibilities rather than erode them, and thus there's this constant debate on immigration. With domestic groups, we often see there's a pressuring of the state to see immigration as a transnational issue. The sovereignty of the state is diminished internally rather than externally. The blurring of boundaries has muddled the precision of the terms of the debate. If we see nation-states as membership associations, the debate on such issues, on the suitability and the integration potential of immigrants into a nation is logical within such a context. Coinciding of immigration and nation building is the case of the United States, where the issue of immigration is seen as client politics, but less so in Western Europe, where nation building predated official immigration. The identification of certain cultures of new immigrants and their computability with the dominant host nation's culture is often the source of intense debate. What is obscured by this perspective are the porous boundaries between groups, the diffuse notion of identity, the deterritorialization links between members of groups, the globalizing patterns of communication, and the hybrid process of cultural transformation. Nevertheless, for nations such as the United States, Canada, and Australia, such debates on the clash of cultures is really, can be seen within a sort of historical trend of immigration post-World War II. The Australian case is quite apt to understand the immigration sort of debate. Over the last 2 decades, the Australian government has taken an increasingly firm stance towards asylum seekers who attempt to arrive in Australia by boat. One of the most aggressive government responses to curbing the increase of asylum seekers in recent years has been the Malaysian People Swap, formed through a bilateral agreement between Australia and Malaysia. Under this arrangement, the first 800 asylum seekers to arrive in Australia by boat were to be transferred to Malaysia, in return for Australia accepting 4,000 refugees from Malaysia. Now, what we do see is that the People Swap faced many obstacles. In August 2011, for example, the policy was declared unlawful by the High Court of Australia. And it was done so on the basis that Malaysia is not legally bound to provide the asylum seekers protections under Australian law. In response, the government at the time twice attempted to pass legislative amendments to circumvent this sort of ruling and allow for the implementation of the People Swap. On both occasions, it was unsuccessful. What we do find, however, is that populism, wedge politics, and a culture of control were all explanatory factors behind the People Swap. While the use of language has shifted subtly when comparing the Julia Gillard's era to the John Howard's era, at its core, the policy debate remained the same. This holds numerous negative implications for the quality of Australia's political debate and policy formulation, as well as for asylum seekers and refugees themselves. There's a nexus between populism, wedge politics, and the increasing number of asylum seeker boats coming to Australia. These three dimensions appear to feed off each other. As boatloads of asylum seekers increase, this fuels populist antipathy towards asylum seekers and resentment of the government. With populist sentiment flourishing, wedge politics now come into play. And for the Gillard government in particular, this left it politically weakened and lacking control over the political agenda. The dominance of populism and shrewd wedge tactics has implications for the quality of Australia's political debate on immigration. The pragmatic business of staying in power has disintegrated the worth of a political discourse, with politics portrayed as nothing as grubby business. This is most lucid in relation to Australia's asylum seeker debate, with both major parties guilty in hypocrisy. The prevalence of populism and wedge politics does hold consequences for the asylum policy agenda. First, it pushes governments to create short-term and expedient policy making. And this sort of pursuit of a quick fix is nowhere clearer than in the People Swap policy. Second, we see that the Labour Party in Australia is matching the coalition in their tough approach. Australia has been in this trajectory where sending refugees offshore has become the new norm. Furthermore, given the culture of control, it may influence Australia's response to asylum seekers, and this holds significance for the future direction of asylum policy. The pervasive culture of control illustrates how control imperatives can trump economic and humanitarian concerns when it comes to asylum policy in Australia. In such a climate, you can only hope that the human rights of asylum seekers are not forsaken. The issues associated with mobility and migration does not end at the boundaries of the nation state. Identities are no longer state-based, but have become transnational and stretches across diasporas. It does beg the question in the future. Does this mean that nation states will find it increasingly difficult to maintain a single national identity? This concludes our lecture on immigration. In our next lecture, we'll look at ethnic settlement and human capital.